My name is Eugene Puryear, and we are here at the People's Conference for Palestine in Detroit. It's actually the second annual People's Conference for Palestine, and thousands of people are gathered here to discuss where we are in the state of the movement, where we need to go, a lot of the great organizing work, the cultural work. I mean, so many different aspects of this unbelievably powerful movement that has emerged in solidarity with Palestine in the midst of a genocide. And I think that you can see that there's tons of energy here, despite the challenges, despite the ongoing Israeli atrocities and crimes, to continue pushing, to keep organizing, and to keep going. What we're seeing in Sudan, what we're seeing in Congo can be boiled down pretty simply to this, is that there's a battle raging all across the African continent to say that the 500 years of humiliation, of colonialism, of the impact of the slave trade, of neo-colonialism, is that going to continue for another century, another 2 centuries, or is there going to be a significant change in the continent? Are people going to be able to take hold of their resources and use them to transform their lives, as opposed to just transform the bank accounts of rich people in Europe and the United States of America? And the two conflicts are very different, but when you really look at what's happening, you can see that there is a concerted attempt by those who have been benefiting from the theft and of the resources of the African continent, from the exploitation of the labor of the African continent, and that's internationally, and the elites in Africa themselves are trying to suppress this new impulse. So in Sudan, you have a proxy war that broke out after a massive protest movement that really was trying to make the country more equitable and more fair in every single way. You had a number of international forces from the Gulf states, from the United States, and from Europe who did not want to see that change happen. They imposed some other changes that have resulted in what is ultimately a proxy war between 2 different factions of elites about who's going to be the interlocutor with the imperialist and with the West over the wealth of Sudan, which is great. And in Congo, we see this long-running issue that has been really running since Lumumba was assassinated in the early 1960s over whether or not the resources of Eastern Congo, which has $24 trillion of mineral wealth underneath its soil, is powering the 21st century economy in terms of our phones, our batteries, electric cars, all these different things, that there are people who are profiting from that tremendously. But there's also a big upsurge in the Congo of younger people in particular who want to see a change. But there's also a lot of elites, many of them based in Rwanda and Uganda, but also in the DRC, by the way, who are themselves fighting amongst one another to try to impose a reality on the Congolese people, particularly in Eastern Congo, that will keep them mired in poverty and exploitation and oppression. So in both places, what we really see is a playing out of a broader process that has a lot of contradictions, a lot of different nuances, a lot of different pieces to it, but it really all boils down to the fact of whether the same sort of combination and nexus of international, regional, and local elites in both countries will be able to keep the status quo the way it is, or whether or not there's going to be significant positive change for the masses of people in both countries. Well, I think one of the biggest obstacles is the lack of knowledge. I mean, when we're talking about the African continent, I mean, the level of coverage that we exist in the mainstream media, the level of mythology and propaganda that's put out, not just in the media, but even from a lot of academia, means that most people don't know that much about what's going on. To the extent they do know, they have the most simplistic narratives. Things are being wrapped in this traditional, it's just Africans fighting, and poor people and all these other things that don't let people see what's really going on underneath. And that most of what you see in Africa is based on a framing that is set forward principally by the United States and Europe about what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, and what the sort of contours of African governments are going to be allowed to do. And so I think that's really the first step. And I think you can see similar things with struggles all around the world. Is the first step is often people becoming educated and knowing what's really going on, understanding the stakes, and be able to fit in the relationship to the struggles that they care about. So I think that's really one of the biggest obstacles we face right now, at least in the US, to building stronger solidarity movements, is even the knowledge of what's going on and the knowledge of how it affects people here. Well, I think the struggles that are happening across the African continent are all interconnected. And everywhere you go in Africa, I can tell you that the leaders of the Alliance of Sahel states are very popular. And in many ways, what happened in Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger, these huge mass protest movements that rose up and overthrew existing governments to establish a new reality, is what happened in Sudan in 2019. Just unfortunately, they weren't able to consolidate their gains. But when you look at what people were talking about in Sudan, they were talking about ending the IMF and the World Bank structural adjustment programs, having a more equitable distribution of wealth from mineral resources and agriculture, spreading the wealth, not just in terms of from sort of rich to poor, but also the different regions of the country, which have been denied many different opportunities for development and growing up development. Absolutely, they were talking about the need to continue to have solidarity with the Palestinian people, and you can see certainly on an everyday basis all across the Congo, all the popular social movements that are fighting in many different ways around the rights to water, around the rights to land, around the realities around having more rights to their mineral resources, are directly talking about what is happening in the Alliance of Sahel states, where they're taking back many of their resources, they're increasing the revenues that are coming in, they're putting them towards healthcare and education. It's a major part of the discourse. You can see the same thing in Kenya. I mean, Kenya, which has had the Gen Z uprising, where millions of people have risen up against the government of President Ruto, people are talking about what's happening in the Alliance of Sahel states. They're talking about the need to make real transitions away from neocolonialism, to challenge capitalism, to have more equitable distributions of wealth, more access to opportunity. So everywhere you look in the continent, you have a lot of interconnected movements that are learning from each other, talking to each other, that are expressing similar things. I mean, Senegal is another example of this, with the struggle of Ousmane Sonko, who's now the prime minister, against a government that was trying to suppress a mass popular movement against French-backed neo-colonial governments there in Senegal. You could see it in northern Nigeria with the huge protest movements that arose in 2024 that were looking very similar to the movements that ultimately led to what we see in the Alliance of Sahel states. So I think it's very consistent across the entire continent that there really is a mass protest movement rooted in the young population. I mean, 70% of the African continent or something of that nature is under the age of 35. There are people who do not want to live anymore in the reality that they saw their parents and their grandparents of deprivation, of poverty, while others are getting rich on the backs of African land, labor, and resources. And so I think it's very connected. There's a lot of cross conversations, and I think we're going to see a lot of transformations happening across the continent in the next several years. Well, the links between Sudan and Palestine are long and deep. And Sudan is historically one of the countries that has been the most supportive of the Palestinian liberation movement going back many, 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 many years. And so this is actually part of the sort of cultural and political DNA, almost across the political spectrum in Sudan, of people being very strongly supportive of Palestine. And it's worth noting that the mass protest movement that arose in 2019, part of the way that the elite forces that were tied to the military were able to get the support of international forces, and especially the United States, to sort of put down the protest movement and establish themselves as the new leaders, was actually to join the Abraham Accords and to actually become a part of normalizing with Israel. Now, of course, now the army, which is one of the fighting forces, is trying to walk that back, as is the RSF. At one point they were all for normalization. Now that they're all looking for support around the world, they're claiming that they're supporting Palestine. But we have to recognize that this is what actually brought the U.S. heavily into the situation in Sudan, to help put down the mass protest movement, to end the reality of Sudan as a base for the Palestinian liberation movement. And when you look at so many of the sanctions the U.S. has put on Sudan, you can see many of the companies that are sanctioned because they were supporting different factions inside of the broader Palestinian liberation movement. So this is a long-standing thing in Sudan. The resistance committees, which are the backbone of the mass protest movement, one of their main demands after the initial coup, which placed the military leaders in power before the civil war, was in fact to roll back normalization and to actually continue to support the Palestinian people. So the connection is close. And when you look at what's happening in Congo, there's also a deeper connection there. I mean, Rwanda, which is really at the centerpiece of this sort of elite, internationally backed attempt to control the resources of the Congo for primarily Western corporations, from Apple to Ford Motor Company. Since we're here in Detroit, might as well mention that one, is very close to Israel. And in fact, whether we're talking about cybersecurity, whether we're talking about agriculture, whether we're talking about many different things, Rwanda has always had a close relationship with Israel and has never really put any position in support of the Palestinian people, which historically many African countries, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, have had as a major part of their understanding and their discourse is support of the Palestinian people and national liberation movement. But countries like Uganda, also very close to Israel, by the way, and countries like Rwanda have played a significant role. Israeli, bankers and miners and others are deeply involved in the Eastern Congo. And, listen, you look at places like Birzeit University, which is in the West Bank in Palestine, they celebrate Congo Week. They build solidarity with Congolese people. And so definitely when you are dealing with people on the continent, in Congo and Sudan, Palestinian liberation is deep, and the relationships between Israel as part of the broader U.S. imperialist regime is playing a key role in helping to try to keep down the popular movements all across Africa, including, by the way, in Western Sahara, where they're heavily, supporting Morocco, who is also normalized. So you can see everywhere the hand of Israel trying to put down the popular movements that are trying to transform people's lives in the African continent after 500 years of humiliation. if you're certainly a journalist, the most important thing you can do is try to cover this and try to find the myriad of voices that exist, both Congolese and Sudanese, that can speak out in every possible language. So there's no shortage of people who are involved on the ground in the diaspora who are able to help explain what's going on and how people can understand it in a better way. And if you're an activist, especially here in the United States, continue to raise the issue, continue to make the connections. I mean, let's look at the big companies, the big corporations that are ultimately responsible and complicit for the reality that's going on. I mean, right now, for instance, Congo is challenging Apple in the courts in France, and Apple is saying we have nothing to do with anything that's happening in the Congo. But without the voracious appetites of the Western multinationals, you would not have the pressure that goes all the way down to the level of 13-year-olds in pit mines and having short lives and being poisoned by mercury. I mean, it is really being driven by this broader U.S. capitalist imperialist economy, and we have to hold those corporations accountable because they are right here where we are in the belly of the beast. And I think that we can do that. We can make those links. It's very possible, and we can continue to push. And I think we have to continue to demand that there be a popular push for a backing away of these Western governments of the broader anti-people forces in Sudan. And I think that the U.S. is playing a very particular role trying to put its thumb on the scale. We have to demand it stop.